I'm Steve Hitty. I'm a professor of ethnicity, race, and migration, American Studies and History, and I'm director of Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, which has helped us support this event. The RITM Center at Yale exists to help develop and draw attention to urgent work related to race, indigeneity, and transnational migration, and we're grateful for our amazing colleagues and collaborators, and indeed all of you. Let me thank my Professor Lisa Lowe and the organizers of this event for the gathering. Let me thank the panelists and others who traveled to be here, and of course our center staff, including Nicole Edwards and Maggie Katz, who helped with many of the behind-the-scenes logistics to make all this happen. Here in this windowless space, enclosed by cement and steel and wood, we're bubbled in the kind of architectural membrane, it seems to me, that can too easily blind us to where we actually are. So I'll remind you that New Haven has long been home to Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pawcatuck, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples. And that we're surrounded, not just in this room, but out in the rainy outdoors, by patterns of violence, but also patterns of creative survival and persistence every day. For me, our location underscores the importance of corroding the seemingly impermeable modernist walls here and the Gothic walls of other university spaces. We've been looking forward to this event for a long time. Thanks so much for coming. I'll now turn this over to Elizabeth Hinton. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank you and the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration for all of your generous support for this event, in particular to Nicole Edwards, Maggie Katz, and the RITM staff for their work in making arrangements for the visitors. I also have to give a huge thank you to my colleague Lisa Lowe for really making this possible and for doing just all the organizing behind the scenes. And thank all of you for coming. We have over 120 other people tuned in virtually and counting. So I just really want to thank all of you for joining us for this conversation. I'm Elizabeth Hinton. I'm a professor of history, African American studies, and law here at Yale. I'm the author of From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, and America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s. And it is such an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to engage with Robin D.G. Kelley, Derecka Purnell, and Garrett Felber, really among the best thinkers and activists out there today, to think collectively about liberation and how we might create a better world. It's a conversation that has increasingly grown more urgent, even if some of the terms and the contexts have changed in the nearly 2 years since the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. I think we all really want to know where to go from here. So we're going to have the conversation for about 15 minutes to an hour or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. Those of you turning in virtually, feel free to submit your questions at any time. I'll be monitoring the chat or the Q&A, and maybe I'll throw a couple in there during the moderated conversation. And then when we open it up, you'll see 2 microphones on either side of the stage. Please feel free to come down and ask questions. That's really the most exciting part of the conversation. And then after the event, we encourage you to join us for a book signing with any of the authors up here, but especially Derecka Purnell, whose book I'll talk about in a second, is the most recent. We have decided about this.
Thank you.
And that book signing was made possible by one of New Haven's gems, the independent bookstore People Get Ready books. So thank you so much to Lauren and the People Get Ready team for making this happen. All right, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. I'll go in order of how they're seated. So Garrett Felber, Garrett and I go way back to grad school when we were both babies, but he organized one of the most important conferences on abolition that has taken place in recent years, the Making and Unmaking Mass Incarceration, or MUMI conference at the University of Mississippi, where he taught in the history department until last year. MUMI, which took place in December 2019, facilitated a cross-generational conversation between students, scholars, and activists, and it was really amazing. Derecka and I were both there on a panel on abolition, so we know. And it was also really important because Garrett held an unapologetically abolitionist conference in Mississippi. Felber organizes many, many things, but among those projects is Study and Struggle, which challenges criminalization and incarceration in Mississippi through mutual aid, political education, and community building. Felber received his PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan and is the author of Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, The Black Freedom Movement, and the Carceral State, and the co-author of The Portable Malcolm X Reader with the late Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Manning Marable. And Felber is currently with us at Yale as a visiting fellow in American Studies and the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, where he has worked to complete his next book, a biography of former political prisoner Martin Sostre called We Are All Political Prisoners. To Garrett's left is Derecka Purnell, who is this generation's most galvanizing voice around abolition. No, we all know it's true. She's a triple threat. She's a grassroots organizer, she's a lawyer, and she's an author. Her book, let me just show it all to you so you will go purchase it. Becoming Abolitionists, Police, Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom just came out last October, and once again is available for purchase outside. You can get Derecka Purnell to sign it for you today. And in addition to this powerful book, which everybody needs to read, and if you're in my African American history survey class, you're going to be reading it. Purnell's writing has been published widely, including in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Boston Review, Teen Vogue, and Harper's Bazaar. Purnell received her JD from Harvard Law School and has lectured, studied, and strategized around social movements across the United States, the Netherlands, Belgium, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and Australia. She is currently a columnist at The Guardian, a Margaret Burroughs Fellow for the Social Justice Initiative's Portal Project at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and a scholar in residence at Columbia Law School. And finally, Robin D.G. Kelley is the Gary B. Nash Professor of History at UCLA and the greatest living historian in America. He needs no introduction, so I'm just going to stop there. No, I'm just kidding. If I were to properly introduce Professor Kelley, who I've known now for over 20 years. 20 years. I'm aging us. Since I was a bright-eyed 18-year-old at NYU. I would need to take 30 minutes.
Before that.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I went to your house when you were a kid.
Yes.
Because I know your dad.
But I don't remember you.
Exactly.
I just remember you from the Intro to Black Urban Studies class.
Right.
But anyways, okay, so Professor Kelley received his PhD in history from UCLA and has been bringing us hit after hit ever since, from his articles and op-eds to his 13 books, including the groundbreaking and award-winning Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists Since the Great Depression, Race, Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, and Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, among others. And these works have illuminated aspects of the history of social movements and capitalist exploitation in the US and the world that have inspired generations of activists, organizers, and scholars to struggle for racial and economic justice. So getting to have this conversation and sit down with the three of you was really a dream come true for me, and I hope for all of you as well. So abolition is a process that in many ways really begins in our own minds, right? In our own understanding of the world and our political and ethical commitments. And all of you have been doing this work for some time. And so I'm wondering if you could each share with us how you came to abolition as a politics and as a practice, and how you think about the meaning of abolition. I guess like how you define abolition. So we'll start with Garrett since he was introduced first.
Okay. Hi everyone. Can you hear me okay? Well, it's such a, I don't know. I wiggled my way onto this panel somehow, and I'm just so grateful to be here. And, you know, I want to start by just saying thank you to all the incarcerated comrades who I struggle with and learn from all the time. I'm hoping we can transcribe this conversation and send it to them. And then also my co-panelists who I've learned so much from. So most of anything I say helpful today will come from those folks. I think to begin with the definition of abolition, for me, it's a revolutionary practice to create an egalitarian society, free of coercion and domination, that sort of obviates the need for police and prisons and punishment. And I emphasize, I think, both revolution and practice, because I think one of the mistakes that we make is to think of abolition as a set of sort of beliefs or an identity. And it really does us no good to have people who identify as abolitionists, right? That doesn't get us free. So it's also not a destination. We don't do things and arrive at this place in particular. So I think it's something we do every day and we stumble through it. And I think experimentation and creativity is sort of central for me to that practice. My personal journey to it. I really was sort of politicized through history, really thanks to Robin's writings in particular. Freedom dreams, I mean, Derecka writes about this beautifully in her book as well. Freedom dreams for me was a whole new roadmap to thinking about radical social movements, not in terms of success or failure, but as a sort of collective dream-making process. And I read that the same year that I read Black Study, Black Struggle. And that article, Robin talked about the classroom not being a place of love, and therefore not a place of deep critique. And that really resonated with me at the time because I was teaching in a minimum security prison. We were teaching, learning about the Black radical tradition. And he mentioned study groups. And I was like, what is a study group? My encounter with these radical social movements was only through university and college spaces, which didn't feel like a place of love and deep critique and accountability. And I was, for the first time in a prison, encountering that space. And that was a paradox or a contradiction to me. Like, why was I encountering this space of love and commitment within such a violent place? So there was an undergraduate student at the time who asked me my thoughts on abolition, and I spouted off some very uninformed things about utopianism and, it sounds nice, but how would we ever do that? Like the script that we all sort of fall into the first time I think we encounter abolition. And I think that script tells us something really important, a few things. One of which is that we're all sort of performing something that we've been normalized to believe about the function of prisons and punishment in society. And it's actually very helpful in organizing to undo them because we encounter the same set of beliefs. What about the murderers? What about the rapists? It's utopian. How would we ever create this society? So I guess it didn't take me that long to sort of get from that place to believing that prisons shouldn't exist and police should not exist. But I really think the practice of what that actually looks like beyond just sort of going around pronouncing that I believe this thing is the ongoing work of abolition, of every day being in touch with people inside, figuring out how to support them, and to dream collectively. I can maybe talk about that more throughout, but I think so much of the way, for me, the journey through this has been always in sort of tension and tandem between the prison and the university. And it's been really helpful for me to understand the way that both of those institutions work to stop collective dreaming. Those are institutions that work to silo us, to venerate individual thought and solitary thought, and not collective thought and collective mobilization. So for me, that's been the sort of ongoing work, is to figure out how to collectively dream and understand the people who have collectively dreamed before us, because we're so often cut off from all the work that they've done. And that's why I think Freedom Dreams for me was such a touchstone, because I realized that we have to understand that ongoing process of collective dreaming. Oh, I have a couple clips of Comrades Inside to play, but maybe I'll do it after both of you go, because I don't want to monopolize time.
Yeah, play it.
Okay, all right. I don't know if this works. Can people just hear me if I shout? Okay. So one of the things when I was trying to think of something useful to say today was that I just wanted really people to hear from folks inside who I organize with. So I'm just going to play a couple of clips. I asked them to share a few words with you. The first one is from a dear comrade, Lawrence Jenkins. He's incarcerated in Washington State, just a revolutionary organizer, farmer, artist. And the second is Stevie Wilson, who folks might be familiar with as well, who's incarcerated in Pennsylvania. So I'll just share those.
I want to speak on the importance of political education and solidarity in our struggle to survive, get free, and stay free. But first, I would like to address the shortcomings of the prison abolitionist movement today. There is a belief that mutual aid and general correspondence alone will help us survive genocide and escape torture, when instead, these caring acts only help us manage and cope with these conditions while doing nothing to liberate us from them. This approach will only help prisoners suffer peacefully, and while assimilating our movement into the power establishment in which controls the mechanisms of state violence and oppression, the very thing that developed mass imprisonment as a tool to displace and dispose of entire communities. This must be met with critical resistance and revolutionary action. It is on us abolitionists who are sincerely committed not just in thought, in words, but in action and practical application. We are confronting material conditions that must be done away with completely. We are embracing visions, programs, and processes that ensure autonomy, independence, collective self-determination, and sustainability. These are things we've identified as primary aims and objectives to ensure our survival, maintain our freedom, and secure our destiny. And we are committed to do this till we free us. Being that we are having this conversation in a higher learning institution today, I must emphasize the importance of political education, as well as cultural studies and why it's needed for prisoners. Simply put, we lost the knowledge of what we once knew. We lost control of what we once won. We lost the belief that we can do whatever we put our mind to. We need this re-education and re-empowerment in order to further develop a counterculture that can be shared with the mass movement fighting on our behalf and on behalf of our loved ones and communities against mass imprisonment, racism, and oppression. We are all at different stages of development in our journey. Each state has its own laws, policies, and practices. Each prison has its own variation of genocide, slavery, and cruel and inhumane torture. But in meeting us where we are at, coming with a sincere commitment to helping us come to a level of consciousness and ability that will help us not only meet our basic needs, but also help us achieve our aims and objectives and secure our freedom. As Grace Lee Boggs taught us about revolutionary humanism, organization means commitment, and that's what we need from today's abolitionist movement.
Is there a way to turn up the volume at all? Because the people on Zoom are having a hard time hearing.
Can I turn up the volume from here? Can you do it? Okay.
I don't know if that will help. But. And if not, then maybe we can post them wherever we post them. Yeah. Well, so for those on Zoom, we will post these audio files after the event.
This is Stevie, and I wanted to take this opportunity to make a few comments. So thank you for the opportunity, Garrett, and everyone on the panel for allowing me to be a part of this and to say a few words about the abolitionist movement, the state of the movement itself. And I want to begin with a quotation from Angela Davis from Freedom of the Constant Struggle. And then she says, whenever you conceptualize social justice struggle, you will always defeat your own purposes, and you cannot imagine the people around whom you're struggling as equal partners. Therefore, if, and this is one of the problems of all of the reform movements, if you think of the prisoner simply as the object of charity of others, you defeat the very purpose of the anti-prison work. You are constituting them as inferior in the process of trying to set their rights. She continues by saying,
This is a call from Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Camp Hill. This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
He continues by saying the abolitionist movement has learned that without the active participation of prisoners, there can be no campaign. Just as a matter of fact, it may not always be easy to guarantee the participation of prisoners, but without their participation and without acknowledging them as equals, we're bound to fail. And I find myself repeating this quite often to people on the outside that they need to look at the in-prison population as equal partners, and they need to get connected to people inside, because the only way they're going to know what's happening in here, really what's happening here, is that you are connected to people inside. You cannot depend upon the state to tell you how they're treating us. You cannot depend upon the state to tell you what's going on in here. So it's important to be connected to people inside. And I've also said before that if you are doing this work, all right, and you are not connected to someone inside, then you are absolutely wrong. So I think that's important for us to be connected to one another, and that we have to think about ways also that we can proliferate opportunities to contribute for people inside, and how we can actually grow the capacity of people inside. And one of the ways is collaboration. I encourage everyone to truly collaborate with people inside, so that we grow the capacity of the people inside. This is really important. Instead of coming to a project already formulated and just asking people to participate in it, then I'm asking you to actually create programs, create these projects with people inside, and not be like the DOC, Department of Corrections, who actually, they never ask for our consent, and they only ask for our cooperation, actually kind of force us to cooperate with them. And that's kind of what a lot of people out there who are doing this work do. And I mention consent because quite often people outside who are doing this work, they make statements, they create campaigns, they take action on behalf of people inside, but they don't ask us if that's what we want. They don't ask for our opinion. They don't ask for our consent.
This is a call from Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Camp Hill. This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
And this creates a problem. And I just give you two examples. One was in Florida, where there was the issue around prison labor, and people were complaining about the grounds crew that was using at a particular prison. And there were 80 people on the grounds crew, and they were complaining about it. It wasn't the prisoners complaining about it, it was actually the people outside. And so the prison decided to get riding mowers and eliminate the crew. And now they have 2 people working. The other 78 people are actually stuck in their cells on this day. So that's not, I mean, if you were to talk to the people inside, first they would tell you how best they handle their campaign. It happened also in Colorado, where there was a lot of bad feelings with people inside who were looking at what people were doing outside when they wanted to change the amendment, the state constitution, feeling slavery in the state constitution, and people inside were afraid they were going to not be able to work anymore, because people inside didn't want to work. They have a reason why they want to work, and they want to, but they were afraid they were going to do their job. And so I think it's important that we look at these campaigns, look at these actions, whatever we're doing, get connected to the people who are going to be most affected by these campaigns. They're going to be most impacted by your actions. I think that's really important. But at the same time, I said, as far as the movement itself, this movement is made up of people. And the only way we're going to win is with the people. So we need to actually also create materials that are accessible to the masses. This is something we struggle with inside. A lot of work is being done. It's being academics talking to academics. It's not academics talking to the masses. And so we need to actually have work that talks to the people, because we're not going to work without the people. And so I would really stress that point. And there are some people who have a really great knack of writing like they want to be read. And I think Ruth and Miriam Kaba, obviously, another person on the panel, Derecka, a person who writes like she wants to be read, and this is the type of work that we can use inside and explain abolition to the people inside, because these are the people most affected by it. So I just, a couple of things I want people to think about, about getting connected, perspective as we create on-ramps for people to be able to participate in this, particularly people inside and their families. And think about how we can do that. All right? Thank you.
So I'll do a quick, sorry that Stevie's was harder to hear. This is speakerphone into my computer. Just to summarize a couple of the key points that Stevie was making, one of them is to get connected to people inside and engage in true collaboration with them. So he was talking a little bit about these sort of programs that are pre-formulated outside and then come in to sort of superimpose a vision onto folks inside, and how that sort of correlates to the DOC's relationship, and sort of led that to talk about consent. And how some of these campaigns that people formulate outside, and he gives examples from Florida and also Colorado with trying to eradicate the sort of clause of the 13th Amendment, that people inside were actually quite concerned about what eliminating that clause might do for their jobs that they rely on for sustenance for themselves and their families. So to collaborate and also think about consent from people inside when you're doing these sort of organizing. And then lastly, about accessibility, I think one thing that Stevie always talks about is how the literature being written about movements and incarceration from within the academy is just simply inaccessible. So a lot of the work that we do together is translation of books into zines. And then he was shouting out Derecka's work as an example of, writing the way that you want to be read. So thanks for listening.
Hi. Oh, okay. There's no strings. I thought it was like strings. It just comes up. Hi. And it doesn't. Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. How are you all doing?
Good.
Okay, never mind. Yes, thank you, Garrett. One thing I really appreciate about you, and I first experienced this at MUMI, it was the first conference that I'd gone to where in the planning, there was a level of intentionality to make sure that people who are currently incarcerated are part of the conversation. And so I'm just so grateful that you did that just now, that we were able to hear from two comrades who are inside. So thank you so much for always making sure that when we talk about this work, we also are actively doing that. And it means so much to me. It's deeply inspirational. So thank you. What was the name of the first person who spoke? Lawrence. It's so interesting. Last night I had a conversation with a group of students at the graduate club who are in the Grand Strategic, yes. And I heard some feedback, so y'all gonna have to give me the tea later about that program. I heard some things, but not everything. But one of the students asked me a question. I can't remember it right now. It was sort of like, what am I concerned about? What's one of my fears? And I shared that I was nervous about the deep pessimistic turn to mutual aid in recent years, because mutual aid is obviously very important, and I think it helps to save lives. And I also shared that I think that the spike in homicides that we've seen in the last couple of years were probably even higher, but for the very important interventions that people were able to provide and pay rent, provide shelter, and do makeshift daycares to take care of each other. But I'm also nervous about the pessimistic turn to mutual aid, which is, this is the only thing that we can do, and I have some control over it, and we're never going to win. The state is just going to find some other way to shift, and we have to figure out how to, do that terrain. So I'm going to figure out how just to pay individuals' bills. I'm going to figure out how just to make sure that people can eat, because as Lawrence said, that then removes our impulse to fight against the repression of the state, which is going to continue. And so I just am so grateful that he said that just directly and straightforwardly. And it's a deep critique that I also share of the movement that we have now. And I just didn't anticipate that. It's not something historically I know there have been pessimistic moves towards flight and, going inward, but that was one concrete thing. So when he said it, I said, okay, I know other people are thinking about this too. All right, so what were the questions? Abolition?
Your journey.
Journey, yeah.
How you define abolition.
Yeah. So that's complicated. Okay, I did write a book about this thing, but I don't. The book isn't like I was a reformer and now I'm an abolitionist. So that is not the book at all. I hope that that's not what anyone in this room like expects, because that's not what the book is. Because no one's born a reformer. Like, no one came out being like, I'm going to reform the police, where's my bottle? Like, no one. Like, that's not true for anyone. What often happens is that we're born with unexamined ideas about the world, and then we're socialized in the institution that we belong to develop ideas about them. Me, I grew up watching Cops. Right, I still fight with my mom because she watched Law and Order, SVU specifically, right? Okay, all right. It's deep. I know. No shade to Lisa Gay. So yes, we learned these. I actually didn't even remember that. So it was literally no shade to Lisa Gay. I'll tell her I'm sorry. Yeah, so we're socialized, right? And so I watched people in my community become cops because they wanted to be better than the racist cop that they encountered. And I knew my mom had a couple of friends who were cops, and I also knew that we ran from cops and cops chased us. So I knew that when someone's home was being getting invaded because a social worker deemed them to be unfit parents, cops were right there to remove children from homes, so we're deeply afraid of them. So there's all these different touch points with policing and with prisons. And so one story I talk about in the book is this campaign that I worked on to close a jail in St. Louis called the Workhouse. And when I was a kid, I had known so many people to go in and out of the workhouse that I thought it was a place where you got a job. Like, I was like, it's called the Workhouse. I didn't know that the workhouse historically are jails where people went who were enslaved and run away, or poor and had to pay a debt in order to secure their release. And so it took years before I understood that, oh, this is a jail and people don't come back for days or weeks or months. But again, just my experiences with police and prisons and prosecutors, it didn't automatically give me an analysis of whether they were worthy of redemption or could be reformed or needed to abolish, right? That came through political struggle. And it was so funny listening to Garrett talk about Black study, Black struggle, and Robin saying something about the study groups, and you were like, what? What's that? Well, I remember when I first met Robin, he was on a panel at Harvard, and he was talking about political education. And I raised my hand, and I was like, well, what do I need to read for my political education? And he was like, well, I can't tell you that. It's really going to come down to the people who you organize with, because you have to read the political materials to debate and inform the campaign or fight that you're struggling around. And I thought that was BS. I wanted Robin to give me like 8 books. I wanted like a political education starter kit. And he was not about that life. I was very frustrated about it. And then I went to South Africa, and I watched that happen. I watched students read and debate different political texts and they used that to inform the demands that they needed in order to fight for the freedoms that they wanted. So I was there. I was watching students say, you know, our movement is about free education because we think that education is a tool of empowerment, similar to what Lawrence just said on the call, and we believe that it will help facilitate our fight for the land here. And so they were making these broader connections between their educational struggles and these broader decolonial demands that to help transform the world that they belong to. And I said this the other day, I was like, well, I was there like watching them read and debate, sometimes physically fight over their ideas because they knew that there was so much at stake. And I remember coming back to the U.S. and thinking about our student demands that weren't informed by political education. And I was like, they're trying to get the land. We're trying to get a diversity office. Like, it was not the same. Like, this is very, very different. Very, very, very different. But that showed me how important a political education meant, how important it was to be a part of a political home and a political organization to help spur your own individual development, but to also do that with other people. And you guys are growing and figuring out how to wage these fights for the long term. It doesn't directly answer like my journey to become an abolitionist because it wasn't linear, right? It happened like a lot of people become politicized in social movements. You sort of hear people talking about different ideas, you know, abolish borders or more diversity, and you can't quite make sense of them. Like, you know that there's a broader history of people who fight for racial and freedom and justice. But until we start understanding the role of political education, we don't understand understand that history, right, of people who are on the good side, it's very different from something like tradition, where people fight for different things according to a set of beliefs that they think will help propel them towards something greater. And I was being politicized around these different traditions. Niall is going to kill me, but I was telling this story literally the other day too, about at his parents' house, there's a picture on a wall, and it's like Barack Obama and Tupac Shakur and Harriet Tubman and Fannie Lou Hamer and like all these amazing like black figures in history, like riding on horses to freedom, right? And I remember years ago, I would have seen a picture like that and been like, oh, this is so amazing, like look at our history, right? And then you develop some political analysis, right, especially radical leftist political analysis, and you realize that these are all very, very different people that we like group in together and say, look at our history, right? Kamala Harris and Fannie Lou Hamer, very, very different. Very, very, very different. You know, would not recommend one. They're very, very, very different, right? And so, but when we just loop them in, when we group them together as black people and black women who are trying to fight for a seat at the table, we miss what makes them possible. And so I was being pushed around what are these different institutions like policing, like prisons, like capitalism, like all these things I had taken for granted, even though I had different touch points with them because I had been student organizing since I was about 14, trying to make sense of them alone. And then once I realized, okay, I have to go through this and understand this with other people. That's why I started developing more radical politics, simply because I was surrounded by people who were more curious than I was, who were more courageous than I was, who were more radical than I was, and who were honestly patient. You know, who weren't trying to convert me to do something, to believe something, right? Who were actually trying to invite me to understand a set of radical politics that then we can force together. So that's why I really hope the spirit of the book is. It's actually less about this is where I was and now this is where I am, but actually all of these touch points for different people I encounter, other organizers, other movements, other ideas that help me understand that an invitation to understand radical politics is much, much, much more than me identifying as an individual abolitionist, which is why the title is plural and not singular, because it's not just about my individual story, but this generation who really has been in conversation with people in other parts of the world and people across time and figuring out how to get free.
Right. That is so true. And, you know, you really, if you don't have the book, shame on you. You really need to get it because in some ways, it is both exactly what Derecka said in terms of movement history, but it also is about the way concepts like abolition change over time in struggle. It doesn't change because a think tank is better than another think tank. It's the movements themselves produce certain kinds of opportunities. So let me go up. I took all these notes. I love the image, this image of the picture. See, my generation,
Yes.
the pictures that you had on the wall were like Kings of Africa, by Budweiser, right? and you talk about like being traumatized, you know, like Kings of Africa. That was like our heroes. And it wasn't like Kings of Africa, anti-imperialist kings.
No,
you know?
Mansa Musa,
Right,
like
exactly.
that kind of energy.
And also, I just want to remind people that piece, Black Study, Black Struggle, is a forum. It's not just my essay. And in the forum is a really brilliant contribution by Derecka Purnell. So you need to read the whole forum, even the people who talk really bad about me. But it's really worth checking out. And it was a really important kind of intervention. I really have, before I sort of answer the question, I just have to acknowledge how important it is to be with these three people specifically, because, you know, I'm the elder, I know that, but I'm also the student of all three. You know, and if you have to, you know, like I don't want to give lists, but if you have to read 3 books, you know, that has to do with the struggle to try to end the carceral state and state violence, you know, you read Garrett, Liz, and Derecka's book. Those, and of course, both of Liz's books, these are really essential texts. And there's nothing like having Liz Hinton as my student, because she was also my research assistant, among other things. But I take a lot of notes. I learned so much from her. I learned so much from Garrett, when Garrett was working on the Malcolm X project, and I was like, and then of course Derecka. So I'm a student of these three people, and I'm a student of many, many people. When I think about my own journey, I think about the folks I learned from over the years. I'm talking about the early years, but later years. I'm a student of Kelley. I'm a student of Sherry Randolph, who's over there. I mean, Sherry was a student of mine, but I was really a student of hers. Michael Denning remembers those days when a handful of us would get on the train to come to New Haven to participate with, all the faculty at Yale to support the union. What was it, 4 people? It was like you and Hazel, David Montgomery. And, it's like I learned from Michael over the years. So I'm very fortunate. I'm just a student. So having said that, I'm not going to answer the question on what is abolition, because I think both the brilliant answer that Garrett gave and everything that Derecka said, and especially in her book, answers that question for me. But I'll say some things about my journey because it helps to understand how I came to understand abolition. And so, first of all, I have to begin by saying, back in the 1980s, no one called himself an abolitionist. To say that you're for abolition was a very specific thing. It was that you're for the abolishing prisons and abolishing the police. And so it wasn't an identity. So at 18 years old, I'm a communist, okay? I'm very proud of it. And so, when you're a communist and you're 18, you already have a view of the world, what it could be. And that view is things that we think of as we call it anti-capitalist now. We didn't say anti-capitalist, just assumed, it was anti-capitalist. Yeah. That the destruction of capitalism itself, well, of course, we had a state-centered, state-oriented idea, so you seize the state. But the most important thing is that things like a transformed environment, a fair wage, housing, transportation, ultimately the elimination of commodities. These are the things that we dreamed of. What's interesting about being a communist in the 1980, really, to be honest, 80, 81, is that we didn't always think of the prison, at least not my circles, as like the thing that needs to be eliminated. What we did do, though, is that we had a sense of what a political prisoner was. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the title of Garrett's book on Martin Sostra. We didn't realize that they're all political prisoners. Of course, that idea is emerging. In 1976, you have the development of documents that are arguing for the abolition of prison. So I grew up in the generation that said, free Geronimo Jijaka Pratt, free Sundiata Acoli. Assata Shakur broke out, but there was a free Assata Shakur at some point. So 70s into the 1980s, there was a whole question about political prisoners as a separate category. Mm-hmm. Now, so here's my development. Number one, in 1988, I'm a brand new PhD, just finished. I meet Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who becomes a lifelong friend. She was on her way to graduate school. She actually, she's a Yale alum in theater. You know that, right? You didn't know that? Oh, you know that. But so she was on her way to go to Rutgers to do a PhD in geography. And she had some ideas that blew my mind. And we weren't talking about abolition, but she was talking about the relationship between space, prison construction, and all the violence that happens to the land, to the environment, to workers, and to human beings put in cages And she's trying to figure that out spatially. And so we had those early conversations of like, wow, you know, that's amazing. So of course, we maintain lifelong friends. I take my second job, which is a job at the University of Michigan. And so we have a Michigan connection, Liz, Garrett, me. And they know, so I was there in 1991 to about 1994. Elizabeth was there as a little baby. And so I'm there, and I end up doing two things that are significant. One, I teach at a place called Boysville, 1992. Boysville is a place where they detain kids, male children, you know, and this is the carceral state. This is a juvenile detention center. And I go in there and I'm teaching, and all I see are poets. That's all I see. A whole room full of poets. Beautiful children. They're all black and a couple Latinx kids. But black kids are poets. And I'm like, and you're in here. And they made me poetry. I still have that poetry. They made laminated poems, right? And then, while I'm there, Michigan, teaching at University of Michigan, I had an opportunity to go to Jackson State and meet some of the older brothers there. And what do I find? Poets. Everywhere you turn, poets. And they're intellectuals, and they're writers, and they're scholars, and they want to get out. There's no reason for them to be behind barbed wire or to have to spend, 90 minutes a day or 2 hours a day in a yard. And we're in the yard talking to them, right? And so my mind's sort of spinning like, this is not even. So the question of political prisoners sort of ceased to be as prominent because you begin to realize that there's a politics of imprisonment. You know, when you hear people's stories, sometimes they might make a mistake or whatever, and they end up in jail. A lot of times, it's like just petty stuff. And yet, there are people I know who are in my class at University of Michigan who do petty stuff that's way worse. And they're not in prison, you know? They go home in their BMWs, you know, and they're paying out-of-state tuition, whatever. So then it's that. And then all this is swirling, and then in 1994, Angela Davis is participating in this conference called Race Matters. And I'm also one of the speakers, you know, I'm like really young, not so young anymore, but, you know, so I'm there, Michael Eric Dyson, a bunch of people. Angela Davis gives this speech, and the room is packed. This is at Princeton. This is in celebration of Cornel West's book, you know, Race Matters Conference. And in this speech, she basically gives a speech that becomes prisons obsolete. Mm-hmm. And she says, in this packed room, and they're there because she's a celebrity. They're there not because they read any of her stuff, it's like packed. People just on the rafters at Princeton. And she says, it is time to abolish prisons. And you could hear a pin drop. Those people are like, what? And I'm there watching the whole thing. And people lie to you. Same people say, like, I was at the March of Washington, they're lying. You know, it's the same thing. Like, they'll say, oh, no, I was with her. No, they weren't. Nobody was with her. Nobody was with her on that. And these are young people. And the first thing they did, hands shot up. What about the rapists? These are black people. Young black students at Princeton, the creme de la creme. I'm sorry, Yale's the creme de la creme. It's secondary. So what I'm saying is that was mind-blowing because I was there. When I say I was there politically. I arrived to completely agree with her on this. And that was 1994. So in some ways, I have to give credit not to, you know, my own thinking independently. It's not even, and I wouldn't even say that it's entirely activism, though that's part of it. Part of it is that I was fortunate to be surrounded by thinkers and intellectuals who thought through these things and showed a mirror to what do prisons really do to people. Between Ruthie, Angela, these kids at Boysville, the folks at Jackson State, and then of course you start to read. And finally, last thing is just dealing with police violence. Jill Nelson published this book called Police Brutality. It came out in 1999. And that book is as relevant today as it was then. This is, right. In fact, it was on the eve of, it was after Amadou Diallo, around that time. And so the point is that in that book, I kind of made the case at the very end of my essay, which is kind of a history of police violence, was that we need to abolish the police. That's 1999. I'm not the first one to say that, obviously. But my point is that was a huge move. And it wasn't a move from reform to a revolutionary stance, because I was a communist. I believed in socialism, and still do. But the point is that it's amazing how the carceral structures are often taken for granted. We talk about the role in reproduction of capital, but not always, but there was a belief that somehow they could be transformed or reformed, because there's some people who need that we need police, that we need prisons. So the leap is huge. And that's why, the last thing I'll just say about this, and that's why we have to remember, and Derecka makes this point in her book, that as much as we talk about the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, but the 13th Amendment, the clause that says, essentially, you could still have slavery as long as someone commits a crime, nobody was questioning that in 1865 or 66, because, in fact, Du Bois, in his grand Black Reconstruction, was very proud of the fact that Reconstruction moved from the prison camp to the penitentiary. That the penitentiary was the modern iteration, the safer, more humane sort of solution to deal with prisoners. So we've made a huge leap from that. But we're not going back to an old abolition. This is a new abolition. And that was a product of these kinds of struggles. So that's sort of my journey, but I've stopped there, and just simply say, we have to always pay attention to the institutions that have become so normative. And that's not just the prison, it's the family. There's all kinds of things that we think about, that we think is normative, that those things are untouchable just to fix them. So we have to think really hard about that. So to be an abolitionist is to change everything, as Ruthie would say,
Yes.
and it's to live life in rehearsal, which is also Ruthie's term. So I'll stop there.
Thank you all for sharing and for those comments. It's a reminder, I think, as Garrett said, that abolition itself isn't linear, that it's constantly evolving, and that it grows out of ideas and discussion and struggle. So 3 of us up here are historians, and I would be remiss if I didn't invite us to talk about history. And so, Robin and Garrett, I'd like you to share some of your expertise on the history of and struggles for racial justice. And Robin, we just read portions of Hammer and Hoe in my African American history survey, so the Alabama Sharecroppers Union has been on my mind a lot lately. And I'm wondering if you could just help us think through some lessons that we can learn about how to organize and sustain radical social movement from the history of communist organizing in the 30s and 40s, as well as drawing from other aspects of your work, maybe cultural forms like jazz and hip hop. And Garrett, and those who know don't say, you introduce a concept called the dialectics of discipline as a way to consider the kind of simultaneous rise of collective Black resistance and escalating state repression, like increased reliance on solitary confinement and maximum security prisons, as a reaction to protest and mobilization among incarcerated people. And you, and in many ways all of your work, helps us see how the carceral state and the movement to abolish it really rose together. So I guess it's a similar question that I'm asking of Robin, and that is, what can abolitionists today learn from the struggle of incarcerated Muslim activists in the 50s and 60s? And where do we see the dialectics of discipline in prisons today?
Well, Garrett can go first.
Well, chronologically.
Oh, no,
You need to be in the history question too.
no.
I know. Well, I have a third.
Yeah, I figured Liz had a question for me.
I'll pose that now. So the question that I had for Derecka, and I think, everybody can comment on these questions, but since you're the lawyer among us, she is the only one on
Barely,
stage with the
Jesus.
JD, I would really love for you to reflect on the relationship between abolition and the law. And as you know well, the law has really served to kind of facilitate and legitimate state violence against marginalized groups, but it also has functioned at times as an instrument of protection and justice. So slavery is abolished, we get Jim Crow is abolished, we get mass criminalization. And I'm wondering what limits and possibilities the law might offer for abolition.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The law and the state, because that also came up.
Yeah.
I mean, do you want me to go first? Because
Anybody, just-
Because
just-
I'm not gonna. I'll be very brief.
Okay.
I can't answer the second question, which is kind of cultural forms, but I will talk about specifically like the Communist Party and the Sharecroppers Union, because I think if there's a lesson there, I mean, we have to remember that these movements were crushed. I mean, crushed to the point where there was almost no memory, and so we have to be prepared in terms of like the longevity of movements to recognize that there's a dialectic, there's ebbs and flows. We wouldn't have had, for the Sharecroppers Union and for the labor organizing in the 1930s, the truth of the matter is that it took a lot of courage, mobilization, a sense of crisis, but it also took space that the state created. And we don't always talk about this, but as problematic as the New Deal was and as racist as it was, certain things were products of worker struggles. And this goes back to the question that you posed about mutual aid versus the struggle of state, that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, that the struggle to create a national labor relations board, which of course doesn't affect sharecroppers because they're not even covered.
Right.
But that did create space for unionizing and for pushing back against companies that create basically company unions to undermine the organizing efforts. In terms of the sharecroppers, they may not have had the National Labor Relations Board behind them, but they had a couple things behind them. The belief that with all this dynamic organizing going on, that they also need to be out there organizing, even if it meant engaging in shootouts with police. And then secondly, the most amazing thing, this has to do with internationalism. The most successful movements in the 20th century are those that actually either have connections beyond borders or believe they have connections. You don't have to actually have real connections, but what's beautiful about the Communist Party in Alabama is that they're like, we are an extension of the Soviet power. And we know, and they said this, some people I interviewed said, we knew that when we went on strike in 1935, if anything were to happen to us, that Stalin would send troops. He would send ships across the Atlantic into Mobile, and troops would come into Alabama and protect us. That's solidarity. Now, that didn't happen, but the belief in it, the belief that somehow you're part of something larger and that the working class is not a national class. It's an international class. And this has always been the Achilles heel of American working class struggles, both its nationalism, and nationalism translates into what? White nationalism. It is black workers of color have been always at the forefront of saying we see ourselves as a class. It's the white workers that make the mistake of seeing themselves as a race. And when they see themselves as a race, then they end up joining the wrong side. And this was the message that Du Bois taught us, and this is the message of the 1930s. Because what happened was, once you had the wind of the federal government behind your back, or belief in it, all the white folks who started to realize that, wait a second, we don't have any other option but to organize. And they actually were able to win over a segment of the white working class. And I think for us in the 21st century, this is important. And I'm not making a case against quote unquote identity politics, because my belief in identity politics goes back to Barbara Smith, and the Combine. They have a different understanding of it. But I do think it's important not to get caught up in the silos, and to build power means to basically, you don't have to give up identity, but you do have to build power across the lines of these silos. And sometimes building power means to mobilize people who at first are against you. It means mobilizing people who may share your same interests politically, but they don't know better. What's the point of political education? Right? Is a political education to basically get people to agree with you and get them in a room and say, yeah, Walter Rodney, Or is it to try to build with people who don't really know, Because the thing is, it's not as if the state is picking and choosing who they're trying to bring into their realm, right? So we have to think in those terms, and those are the lessons to me of the 1930s.
Where are we going chronologically?
Yeah. Let's
Yeah,
go kind of
okay.
chronologically.
So I'm all over the place. I think I'm going to interpret the question as sort of a broader, like, what can we learn from the struggles of imprisoned people? Because I think that I'm thinking of the new project too, and just what you all are saying. And I mean, for me, not even historically, just in this moment, like what thinking about the struggles of imprisoned people has allowed me to do is see everything else differently. So I see the university differently because I understand its relationship to policing and prisons. And that's been useful for me. I mean, like, when we think about these sort of campaigns to have cops off campus, right? Yale can't exist without police and prisons. It's not just about eradicating police from the campus, right? Like, the only way that Yale can operate through dispossession, through incarceration, through imprisonment, through land seizure is through police and prisons. So, like, when you read George Jackson talking about fascism, reform, right? It's like people don't think we're living in a fascist police state, but it's because you don't feel the fascist police state the way that Lawrence feels it, the way that Stevie feels it. Right. They would think it's ridiculous to say we are not living in a fascist police state. Stevie can't receive his writings. He writes things that are published in the so-called free world that he can then not receive back. That's fascism. But it's not fascism if we don't feel it, right? That's what we think. I talk about collective dreaming. This project that I'm writing, that Robin and Derecka were so gracious to read. I try to share my writings on Martin Sostre, who's this, revolutionary anarchist political prisoner with people inside. They can't read it. So there's all this kind of like, talk about censorship and anti-CRT and book bannings. Like, it's happening every day. I promise you, if you are a politicized prisoner, everything you do is mediated through the state, through fascism. So I think what's valuable about not just studying these struggles, but being in solidarity with and in community with people is you're able to understand the way that all these unseen forces of criminalization and incarceration are shaping this, in a way that you wouldn't understand otherwise. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
Yeah.
Dialectics.
That's a great answer.
Okay.
No, it's important. It's important. I'm just thinking about so much about where to even start. So, abolition and the law. The law is kind of trash. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out where's the best way to even start. Is anyone here in law school or want to go to law school or walk past the law school?
There are some, but they're not raising their hand.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. It's so interesting. where do you start with this? So, are you asking if they're compatible, their relationship to each other?
I'm just wondering, like, how you see. I mean, because you're an abolition. I mean, and you have a law degree. You are a lawyer. So, like, what are how can the law be a tool, or is it just trash? I mean, maybe it's just trash.
Well, yeah, but some trash is useful. That's why we go like, oh, let me get this out. Or I wish I hadn't thrifted that shirt. So it's complicated. Yes. So what can I say? I think that sometimes we talk about politicization as like an event that happens in our lives, and then we're like, whoa. But no, people are constantly experiencing different levels of being politicized when we're introduced to different, politics. And so I was politicized around abolition mostly in law school after I already entered, right? So, I talk about, in the book that Michael Brown was killed about 5 minutes from my house about 3 weeks before I started law school. And so I drove from St. Louis to Cambridge trying to figure out how to wrap my head around the movement that was happening outside. And then you go to class, and then you have professors who don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. And then you spend a year in Dean of Students' offices crying so they can send an email to acknowledge how violent and painful this is to try to study for exams while there are dead bodies going viral on social media. So that was like, what is going on? Like, why am I learning about this at this particular moment? I think what was interesting when I told you all when I came back, and I asked the students I was organizing with, there were a lot of us, there were maybe like 100 students who were actively engaged on a daily basis of trying to figure out how to connect what we were learning to what was happening outside. And when I said, hey, y'all, I think that we should probably do political education because I don't think a diversity office is going to help change this. I don't think that hiring a critical race theorist is going to actually fundamentally shake up the things that we're fighting for. I think that we should read and study and think critically about what we're trying to accomplish, especially since we're going to be future lawyers. And after lots of tense debates, our movement split. At least half of us left, half of that group left. And they were like, y'all just want to sit around and read and affirm each other about how right you are. Y'all not trying to actually win or change Harvard. So we're going to leave. And the rest of us entered into a student occupation for the next year and a half. So much so I graduated 5 years ago. And people still who go to HLS call the space we occupy Belinda Hall. That is what we renamed and reclaimed that space, which I think is somewhat noteworthy. But what was so beautiful about Belinda Hall and us going through our political education process, it became the only space on campus where anyone could teach or take a class. It didn't matter if you were a dining services worker. It didn't matter if you were a janitor. It didn't matter if you were a clinical faculty. You can teach or take a class, right? It's where organizers from Boston will come in and train us on organizing techniques, right? It was a place where anyone could come and eat. Is where we, said we don't want police here. I mean, police were showing up to our visuals. To Boston, the Black Law Student Association, when we would have candles and people were crying, it would be police. And when you said that places like Yale don't exist without the police, it's sort of a concrete thing. And so to me, it's not always what about the murders or what about the rapists? That's not why police primarily exist. They exist to manage inequality and protect borders, internal borders, external borders, right? So there are people who struggle with that question so much, Elizabeth, about, how do I grapple with these new sets of understanding that I have about the world and my role in it, and then reconcile that with becoming a lawyer. And there were people who gave up their firm jobs, people who gave up $200,000 a year to pay back their student debt and became public defenders or entered into public service work. There are some people who said, I can't be a lawyer. I can't reconcile this. And they're labor organizers still right now. And so people grapple with it in a lot of different ways. Robin knows this. Every year I have a crisis where I'm like, should I be in a PhD program? So people were struggling with can I actually be a lawyer? And I think the reason why I chose to study for that horrible thing called the bar exam and then become a lawyer is because I knew that there were people in St. Louis who were figuring out how to put pressure on the Ferguson Police Department through this litigation effort with the Department of Justice called a consent decree. And being a lawyer was one way that I could help them. And I already took out the debt. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to have to pay back over $100,000 anyway. Might as well try it out a little bit. And so that's sort of what happened. I felt very lucky and very fortunate to be able to do that. And so Can it be a tool? Absolutely. I mean, if you're a lawyer, you can get people out of jail. You can help people litigate. You can, do what I do, which is those things, but also help think about policy in a particular way to help get bills drafted, right? So I think that's important. I think that people in our community do those things as well who are not lawyers. There's people who do participatory defense. There are people who represent themselves and get people out of jail. I mean, the law is intentionally written in particular language so that people who take out hundreds of thousands of student loan debt can articulate that and then make good on it. So it's really good job security, right? But I'm always inspired when I watch community-based organizations do court watching. They're not, those people are not lawyers. And what do? Every Monday in Kansas City, you have tenants who go and watch eviction court. And because of their presence, because of their organizing, they put pressure on the judge to delay or stop evictions. You don't need a law degree to do that, right? I didn't know that before I went to law school. But the more that I'm a lawyer, the more that I organize, the more that I write, the more that I am in the social movement, I learned how people decide to use the law, but more importantly, how to use their presence and their organizing as tactics to manipulate the law as a non-reformist reform, something that doesn't give it more power and more legitimacy, but actually is trying to decrease the violence or at least mitigate what it's doing in the world. So I think that's important, and it's the answer I'm excited to give, which is different than a question I'm usually asked, which is, can I be an abolitionist and a lawyer? Right, that's the question I feel like I'm asked the most at schools. Can I do these things? I was like, well, I don't know. I think, again, more important than you identifying as an abolitionist lawyer is that you try to be a part of a political organization and lawyer and try to figure out if you can use your skills towards that broader movement. And what's so fascinating, the work that I do in that capacity is not my lawyering work, and I don't get paid for it, right? I don't get paid to be on phone calls for 15 hours a week thinking about student debt cancellation with Dream Defenders. That's not, I didn't go to Harvard Law School in order to do that, but that's something that's important to me because I know that once we figure out how to make sure that we can, cancel and abolish all kinds of debts, fight for universal health care, fight for free education, it increases agency for people to live the kind of lives that they want to live, and we deserve it. And so, I think everyone on this panel know that the way that so many of our hopes and dreams, especially given the professionalization push in the 80s and 90s, that if you want to go do good in the world, to channel that through a career, through a specific career, it's go do this thing, and the right's not doing that. Right. The right's not doing that. I know you said earlier, what did you just say? It reminded me of this. That essentially the doors of white supremacy are always open. Right. That at any moment, it's kind of like, I'm serious, at any moment, if you want to go, when we were talking about the white workers, at any moment, if you want to join a white supremacist organization, you can. You can go do this. It's not, you can obviously become a cop or enter the military or enter any one of these other positions, but they're building, that's grassroots organizing, right? This is stuff they're doing also in their spare time. And so sometimes I'm nervous that people who care about freedom and justice think that they can only do that through a specific career. And it's no, you need to be a part of a political organization or figure out how to support one. That's how we build and sustain movements for the long term. And I'm nervous about the decline of that, especially as I look at what's happening with progressives and the left. It's everyone is doing this through their policy job, and no one's doing this through political struggle. And even though we hear 20 million people will pour into the streets for a protest, that's cool, but 20 million people did not get absorbed into organizations. 20 million people are not outside the White House when Biden says, I'm going to keep choosing to refund the police. 20 million people are not outside of Rikers saying, let these people out because they're dying rapidly. And so that energy that we get excited about when we get those glimpses, that gets called a movement, but movements require so much more sustainability and organizing than those moments. And so we need people, and now I'm this is like an altar call. We need people to join organizations or at least to figure out how to support them so we can fight and build something much more sustainable.
Thank you all for that, and thanks for that, Derecka. And I think too, you kind of ended on a historical lesson because that's what we see. That's what sustained the freedom movement historically.
Yes.
It's been organizing. It's been sustaining it. It's been not just mass mobilizations. Okay, so I have a million more questions, but we're running out of time. So I really want to open it up to everyone else. So please start coming down to the microphones to ask questions. And while you do that, I'm gonna pose one from online from Polly, and then kind of tack one of my own questions onto it. So Polly asked, how can we, who have lived our entire lives within empire, live into political relationships that don't replicate oppressive patterns? And I know that's a really, really important, very broad question. I would also, kind of based on where the conversation is headed, invite you to also reflect on what universities and what university communities can and should do. I mean, we're here at Yale University, which just had its endowment over the past year go up by $10 billion, and yet it gets, the people of New Haven basically subsidize Yale at $160 million a year, and 34% of the kids in New Haven are at or below the poverty level. So how can we think about abolishing structures that we are very much tied to and within? From me and Polly.
Well, I think the last thing you said was, the answer was in the question. I mean, we have, just to talk about Yale, this is an old issue. And of course, Yale's not unique. But you have these land-grant institutions that don't pay taxes, that, where there's this intense union struggle going on all the time for a living wage. And I teach at a school where the basketball coach, makes way more money than anyone else, And so there's some basic things, like, if you think about, reparations and decolonization, take these two themes. Reparations would mean that those institutions like Yale that have been exploiting people on stolen land for 3 centuries owe something. And so, and if you include everything that they've been able to extract and figure out a way to sort of take that and give it back, that's one thing. And this may be a legal regime for that. But decolonization is another thing, In terms of the question about how do you not replicate oppressive systems, something as basic as, fighting for indigenous sovereignty can change a lot of things in terms of not just the environment, but in terms of working condition, housing, because I'd much rather be under sovereign rule of indigenous peoples than I would under the United States, So these are all opportunities, and that basically means each one of those things means 2 things. It means the massive redistribution of wealth and resources that have been extracted and stolen, and 2, it means some complete transformation of governance. And, that may seem like pie in the sky, but there's precedent for that, I don't know if you...
Why y'all looking at me? I don't know. Well, I'm just kidding. Well, what can people be doing at the university? Well, I think I want to say organize. Like, we need people to organize. I think it's very exciting when I see students and faculty and staff organize together. Another major lesson I learned in South Africa was just the students and the staff struggle were united for intentional reasons because the staff were in precarious position. They were being shifted to becoming contractual laborers, which means that they lost health care and tuition benefits and all the things they really fought for to be a part of the university. So those struggles are so important, and it makes me think about the early formations of the first Black Studies programs, in the 60s, those Black student organizations that were forming, they weren't forming like for students. Anyone could kind of come and be a part of them. When they took over campus San Francisco State University, those students, they went, like the Black students and staff, they went into the admissions offices and admitted Black students, because the university wouldn't admit Black students, right? It's like, this is the context. Sometimes I'm nervous that because we don't think about the lengths that people went through for political struggle, the possibilities seem like much more shallow. I think it would be, what would it look like for students here to call for a moratorium? Just a moratorium, just to say, hey, let's stop for a second. Let's pause on expansion of Yale in New Haven. That's a low-hanging fruit. That's not even all the way to decolonization. It's like, hey, no more. Yesterday, when I was leaving the event last night, I got into an Uber ride, and the driver was playing T-Pain, which was really nice. I felt warm and welcomed. I was like, okay, this is good. And I just started asking her questions about what it's like being in New Haven. And she said, well, all my friends are leaving because we can't afford to live here no more. I was like, where are they moving to? She didn't say New York. She didn't say D.C. She said North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And I said, is it because of the cost of living that people like keep going further and further? She said, yeah. She said, you can't live around here. And I was like, why not? And she said, I think she was probably a police officer or a security guard. She had on a uniform. She said, I don't know, I hear activists be using words like gentrification, but I didn't know what gentrification was, but in my entire life, I knew that it was happening, right? And I was like, oh, you got to join an organization. Then I just started doing my little organizing spiel with her, too. She was like, oh, maybe that's not like my thing, but people are going to fight for it, but Yale is just going to win. Yale is just going to win. And I was like, well, you still got to try. We still got to try. So when I see students trying to do that, students, staff, faculty, there are students right now who are suing Harvard over their endowment because it's invested in prisons and things that contribute to fossil fuels. I think that's exciting. I think the Cops Off Campus initiative, I think that's pretty exciting. I think people who are doing inside, outside programs with people who are incarcerated, I think that's important. I think that's all enough. I don't think that's enough. I think those are good starts, but I really do think it's going to depend on what inspires you to get activated and doing that political education with other people to figure out, okay, what's the long-term goal? To say this really quickly, but Garrett, I keep thinking about what you said, Yale wouldn't be Yale. And before we split, that student group I was talking about, when we were reconfiguring our demands, and we said, we need to rethink our admissions policy, we need to rethink tuition, all this stuff. And one of the students said, well, would this even be Harvard if we had open admissions? And had such a fear of losing status when we were fighting for, again, very low-hanging fruit. We wanted the shield of Harvard Law to change because it belonged to a family that bequeathed money to start Harvard Law School, that got that money because he was a slaver, right? Fled during the Revolutionary War, but gave the money to Harvard Law School. And when we fought to even get a shield change, a picture that wasn't even that cute. It wasn't even that cute. But there were alum, including Black alum, who said, is my degree going to mean the same thing? Is my diploma going to mean the same thing if you guys get a new shield? Whoa, come on. And then there were professors. What did they say? Well, if we, want to, change the shield, then if you carry that line on through, we're just going to have to change all the symbols in the United States. I said, is that a critique or a plan? Because that's our plan. I said, yeah.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, why not? I said, this sounds good. I was like, you trying to come to the meeting on Thursday? Right? And so, there's a deep fear of loss, and that deep fear of loss is being conflated with erasure and protecting history. And we have to say, no, this is decolonization. And we have to figure out how to build a more, systemic movement to name that. We can affirm the loss for some people. We can't say just because you're afraid of losing status that this is not worth the fight.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Let's take a question from the audience, from Nasser, who's a student in my AFAM survey class. Thank you for being the first.
Peace, family. Nasser, I'm in Professor Hinton's class. And, I really enjoyed the panel. Thank you for coming, and the crowd too. But, I'm like kind of involved with as a community organizer for Black Lives Matter Patterson, and we're really heavily involved with the mutual aid that you guys talking about. We're very thankful, but we every Friday we go out in the community, right? Police ridden, mass incarceration, just the violence is there, and in giving, it's much more than giving food. It's also about telling stories, and joy and laughter, right? And so it really is a movement of love at the basis, which is at the center, in my opinion, of the political education that we're getting at. But maybe in your experiences, both with research and on the streets activism, what do you think the role is and the importance of love and building that in the abolitionist movement?
It's at the center, I think, is what, that's Robin's article that I mentioned earlier, love, study, struggle. And I just think that love is related to trust and relationships, which are at the core of struggle and organizing. And I think another component maybe that I'll just push out there that's related to love is about commitment, and I don't mean commitment to a set of principles, but a commitment to people, to be around and to not, dip in and dip out, that you have to maintain lifelong relationships with people. And that love can sound really good, and it can also be really hard, right? And we think about how hard love is in our families or our, intimate relationships, but political love for long periods of time can be really hard. People hurt each other, people betray each other. So I think if that's not at the core of the organizing that we do, it can fall apart really fast. And there's that energy when you start organizing and you feel like there's love and all this stuff, and it can get really tough fast, I think, once you enter a kind of period of maturity.
Right. And I would also add this, there's three kinds of love. There's eros, which we sometimes conflate with love. There's philia, which is friendship, and then there's agape. And so when I talk about love, and I think a lot of us talk about love, we're thinking in terms of agape, which Dr. King, is drawing on people like Paul Tillich, calls the constant, relentless struggle to make community, and no distinction between friend and enemy. That's the hardest thing. Now, we may know what forces we're arrayed against, and that's different. But the idea is that you try to create a community that is completely inclusive. And even the people that you don't agree with, you pull them in not for consensus. Because it's not about consensus, it's about constant struggle to make community, which means that you debate, you struggle, you fight, you critique, until you could come to a place of agreement, which we know is always temporary. So just like Garrett was saying, it's very, very hard to do. But you can't, there's no such thing as a movement without love. The irony is that even the Klan, they operate on a basis of really demonic kind of love, And it's about, it's not even on the map, that kind of love. But it's vicious,
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely built on what Robin just said about that constant struggle to build community and a better society for the people who may even disagree with you or who may hate you or may not dislike you. It's hard, so much so. The chapter 4 in the book is called Love and Abolition for that reason, because I care deeply about what that struggle takes. And I try to show this is where I talk about that split in the student movement and how hard that was. Is where I talk about representing a client that I had who was very, very racist toward me and toward other people, right? And I had to stand next to this person in court and vigorously defend that person, right? Is where I talk about the Black Reconstruction and how Du Bois sort of focuses on abolitionists, primarily white abolitionists, and then the critique of Du Bois for missing out the deep revolutionary love and practices that Black insurrectionists did to like flee and like build communities in the face of white supremacist violence. And so I think love has a central place. And I hope my comments about mutual aid, I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm not anti-mutual aid. I am very pro-mutual aid. I heart mutual aid very, very deeply. In the book, I affirm mutual aid, and I think it's very, very important. I think in my earlier comments, what I was saying is that I'm nervous that there's a shift I'm experiencing among like my peers and people who are actually younger than me to mutual aid out of desperation and pessimism, which is not the same as shifting to it out of love. So I have a lot of love for BLM Patterson. I think that's y'all, Zelly, the whole crew. I think y'all doing exactly. I know. See, I think that work is very important. The free refrigerators where people can come get food. I get it. I know we have to keep doing that. I don't think Zelly and everyone there is organizing from that place, right? But I'm nervous about that becoming a widespread thing. That's all.
Thank you.
You ain't know I knew, did you? I know you look surprised.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I have a question from a Comrade Inside, actually.
Oh, great. I don't know if the mic is on.
Oh, is it not? Okay.
Can you,
Oh.
Maybe it turned off.
Maybe
you
this
want to use
one.
this mic? You want to just?
Sorry.
There's also a mic here.
I'm just thinking for the people online too.
Is it
Yeah.
on?
I'm worse at technology. Trust me. Oh.
Wait, is this on? Okay.
Okay. Sorry. Sorry, that was
Closer to
my
my-
fault.
okay,
Awesome.
all right. Okay, is this?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
much better. Yeah.
Wow, amazing. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I have a question from a Comrade Inside. I mean, I also have a question of my own, but I think this is like more important. So if y'all could just kind of speak slowly when you answer it, we're going to try to kind of write down your response. That would be really helpful. So this is technically for Derecka. I think it can work for anyone. It says, hello, Derecka Purnell. I'm a prisoner in Texas, and I received a copy of your book through No Name Books in LA. I became politicized in 2017 through contact with Black and Pink, who you mentioned in your book. It's been my observation that the abolition community is made up of a vast number of diverse collectives, and I was wondering if you had any suggestions as to how these various collectives can communicate with each other and become aware of each other so we can organize as a whole.
That's so cool. Well, I'm at least familiar with the collections and coalitions among abolitionist organizations. Is how actually I came to learn about a lot of abolition organizations because I'm a part of groups and collectives and convenings where people are trying to figure out how to align our work. And so those aren't typically broadcast or public, but they happen regularly. The last one I actually organized was in 2020. It was the last thing I did before the pandemic. And it was a convening on police abolition. And we had no idea that 7 months later, defund the police would be the primary demand from the streets. We just didn't know because this was, it was actually a sad weekend. It was the weekend Kobe Bryant died. That weekend was so transformational and so memorable for lots of different reasons. And that convening, there were dozens of organizations there, maybe 100 people who were trying to figure out our lines of difference and how to build coalition. I know Critical Resistance has had convenings of people doing abolitionist work. MUMI was also incredible, one of the last abolitionist convenings that I attended. I think that I don't know if the person who's asking that question is asking for something that feels like a united front. I want to say that I think any of those number of people who I write about in the book, they know about the other stuff that's going on. And so I don't know if it means that it needs to be advertised better, but most of those convenings, except for the public one like you did, are strategy convenings. We're trying to figure out okay, when people ask what about the murders and what about sexual violence, what's the work that's happening in communities to disrupt that? And to help minimize that. What are you guys doing in your neighborhood? How can we practice that in our neighborhood? And so That is happening, fortunately. I would assume that a lot of these people know. I think that the thing I'm actually concerned about is whether the prison police abolition folks are actually missing out on like the socialism stuff. There's like DSA over here and like abolitionist organizations over there, and they're like Sunrise is like in the middle. So there's like all these interesting, important organizations that are coming up, and I'm nervous that their politics are sort of insular and wrapped around their particular thing. And so I've met abolitionists, people who claim they're abolitionists and still hold on to capitalism. I've met socialists who are staunch anti-abolitionists. And so trying to like get people together, think through our class analyses and our colonial analyses I think that work has to do a lot more. I can give this to you so you don't have to try to type it all right now. And then I can also make some recommendations on where that person can start.
Could I just add too? Well, one, I think we're going to have a transcript of this, so we can also, that will be
And there's
much easier.
recording too, yeah.
To this question about, I mean, this is sort of like a call to action again, like from the front and some tangible ways to get involved. I think so much of the work that has to be done across walls, right, is between us and people inside. But then there's this other barrier to, I think, collective dreaming and organizing, which is people inside between, right? And like the gender segregation that happens in prisons. I mean, the organizing that happens in different prisons is different. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do with Study and Struggle is really act as facilitators outside so people inside can share organizing with each other. So that's part of why we produce transcripts and send them inside and have panels with incarcerated people from different states and then produce a transcript of that to send to other states. And this is not new work. I mean, I don't know if folks are familiar with Yuri Kochiyama, but I've been talking to political prisoners from that era, and they talk about writing people inside. And I was like, oh, back in the day you could write to people inside? And they were like, no, I wrote to Yuri, and then she sent, So there's these interlocutors outside, and this is not sexy work. This is painstaking, unseen labor. But to be the people who are facilitating those relationships, because then people inside don't have to constantly, in isolation from one another, invent and reinvent these things. I just think so much of what the prison is doing is that isolation. It's not just a geographic separation. It's a barrier to the collective knowledge that we all have.
Yeah, can I give one quick example about that? Just to make it very, very clear. In many states, if not all states, if you try to start a petition, you can get into solitary confinement. And a petition is anything that has more than one signature. And so there's like organizations like Fight Toxic Prisons who work with people who are inside to do like one signature petitions, because that's how they have to like build momentum for their cause. Like when you talk about fascism inside prisons, if you try to do something as simple as get 2, 3, 10 signatures, try to organize in your wing, you're trying to start a riot, you're trying to incite a riot. So this is the importance of, I just want to illustrate that, because that to me is one of the examples that make it so bright.
And can I say one more thing? So much of the work we do outside is online, exclusively. People inside have no way of accessing that, which is obvious to say, but to the extent that you can create a sort of printable version of that for people, like I constantly just find myself emailing people and like, was there a transcript? Is there a PDF? I'm like copy and pasting websites into Word documents and sending them. So I just think we need to be cognizant of how that is a barrier for people who are organizing.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you for that question.
Did you want to ask your question? Okay.
Okay, all right, cool. Thanks, Mo. Okay, this is on, right? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. All right. Okay, my other question is that I think there's a lot of appreciable tension in movement work between legal and extra-legal action. I guess this is kind of pushing a little bit more on the question that you asked previously. I think a lot of folks inside sometimes do emphasize kind of legal action just for, small things like, I don't want to cut my hair and things like that. Like in this vein, how would you define non-reformist reforms, and what place, if any, do you think they have in movement work?
You use the term, you don't want to...
No, you're writing about this right now. This is so good.
About non-reformist reforms?
No,
Or
not
about
reformist,
using
but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm writing. Yeah.
Let me throw this question in there too
Okay.
from online, just because we're running out of time. And I think it's on a related point from that question and just the discussion in general. And it comes from someone, Benahoff, online, and it says, Comrades Inside are often struggling to survive the imminent threats and slow death of prison. How do we bridge the gap between survival and politics? And then this is another one I'm just going to throwing a lot out there. Alternatively, would y'all mind speaking a bit about the dialectic between the struggle to survive incarceration and the development of the abolitionist movement?
I see what you did there. Okay, I'll take a piece. Okay, so,
There's a way you can
yeah.
relate it all.
I mean, I think this gets back to the question about law and abolition in a way, and it's just that. So Derecka very carefully crafted the difference between the use of law and being a lawyer and an abolitionist, like a vocational sort of careerist version versus the tool of law. And I think that goes for a lot of different things, which is that I don't think we can afford to leave any tools on the table, right? Like these are all potentially subversive tools if used appropriately. And that doesn't mean that they're not dangerous tools that can wind up being reforms and therefore, fascist. But yeah, I mean, I'm writing about a person who was a revolutionary anarchist and a jailhouse lawyer and used constitutional law to, to mitigate the circumstances that he was organizing in. I mean, he was at one point in solitary confinement, unable to communicate with a single person besides his lawyer. So there the law is both the sort of only gateway to the outside world, and he knew how to write a writ that wound up in Constance Baker Motley's court and got him out of solitary so he could do other things like write a revolutionary newspaper and organize a chapter of the Black Panther Party. So it's I think that kind of relationship of, he wasn't thinking like this constitution that's so sacrosanct will abolish the state, but that was basically the only tool available to him, really. So I think that's my answer to that question.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No,
You know more than me. Well, I'm only going to say one thing about the law, which may not answer the question, but just because, I'm writing something on Mutulu Shakur right now, and we're trying desperately to get him out. And Mutulu has been in prison for a long time precisely because when he got locked up in 1986, he and others made the case that they're prisoners of war. In other words, they turn to international law, international courts, and Geneva Conventions. And so the federal courts, they hate that. The judge hates that. And so his mandatory parole had passed, and he's still locked up, had COVID, still locked up. So I think that there's something to say, just for those of you interested, to look at international law, to look at that as an option, to look at what it means to be a prisoner of war, trying to fight for justice, and that there's certain protections that prisoners of war are supposed to have in the United States or elsewhere. So that's just one area of the law we don't always think about, that's not necessarily reformist reform. But Derecka knows more than me.
What was the part of the last question online? Bridge to the
About
gap.
survival.
Yeah, how to bridge the gap between survival and politics. And yeah, we'll just say that.
But wait, no, what was the second part? Because that was
The
the
second part was, would you all mind speaking a bit about the dialectic between the struggle to survive incarceration and the development of the abolitionist movement?
Yeah, so a similar point came up earlier today in the conversation I was having about abolition, and the way that the person sort of framed it, it was as if the abolitionists are like outside talking about abolition, doing abolitionist organizing, and there are people who are incarcerated dealing with the real realities of like the prison, and they don't have time for like the abolitionist stuff outside because they need access to food, they need access to water, all of this, their experience of overcrowding. And how can I say this? The bridge is there. Like the work comes from that bridge, right? Because most of the people, at least the tradition I hope that I belong to, that I see myself belong to, for 40 years at least of writings and organizing around the prison industrial complex, so much of that direction has come from the people inside. It's like, but for their organizing, their rebellions, their uprisings, I think that has given rise to the prison abolition movement outside of prisons, right? And so you're talking about Angela Davis speaking in 1994, and speaking from someone who was once a political prisoner, right? And so that it's not like how do we get this to like reach each other, but so much of that survivor work, that risk taking, that then informs the struggle that takes place outside. And I want to emphasize that so much, because we're in an era where there's this thing around deference politics, like you defer to people who are directly impacted, right? But the people who they want you to defer to who are directly impacted are people who they decide, and usually people who want to maintain the power of prisons, right? I've never seen at philanthropy conferences abolitionists directly impacted people, or survivors, the type of survivors that people in the mainstream choose to uplift, as we need to be listening to these kinds of Black women. But they're not Black women abolitionist survivors, right? And so I think what's important for us to always name and to explain is that so much of our grassroots organizing, so much of what makes it into the halls at Harvard and to Yale has first been theorized and organized around people who experienced the oppression. Right. That is true of radical politics. That is very, 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 very true, and we must not forget that. So when I hear critiques of abolition being an academic exercise, I'm like, oh, wait. Like, let's go back 40 years ago before the uprising in 2020. Like, let's read the works of people. Look at the demands of prisoners during these rebellions. Yes, they were asking for more freedoms. They were also asking to be free. Right? They were asking for better food and a right to health care because they don't want to die and suffer until they're released. Right? But they also demanded to close prisons. Nas didn't say, if I ruled the world, I would free all nonviolent offenders. Not in my version. Did you hear that? Did Lauren see that on I didn't hear that version. He said, I free all my sons, all, take them out of Attica, send them to Africa. That's the version I heard, So it's like, it's so much, you asked about culture earlier, it's so much in our culture because, again, we learned that based on our experiences. And so it doesn't make us experts, hopefully just helps keep us within that tradition.
Yeah. And by the way, the anti-Klan movement started in prison. You know that, right? The anti-Klan movement in the 1980s began in prison with prisoners who were fighting the Klan, who were hired as guards and wardens. And we forget that. We think that somehow all these movements are on the outside and that, on the inside, people are not fighting those same fights. So this is a perfect example.
Go for it, yeah. Hello, thank you so much for all being here. When I heard that there was a panel with all of you on it, I was like, how did you get this many of the people who I admire in their fields of scholarship onto one desk? But I was really interested actually, and I feel like it's been a theme throughout everything that you all have said. At the beginning, what was the name of the first of the two people inside that you
Lawrence.
Lawrence.
Yeah.
Where sort of Lawrence was saying, look, mutual aid is great and all, but we're not, we also have to keep in mind sort of fighting to actually end these structures. And I feel like there's a disconnect that I see because I grew up fairly politicized, but I became an organizer during the rebellions around, Mike Brown and Eric Garner in New York. And I feel like ever since that moment, I've just seen a disconnect between like both what happens in like organizing spaces and in movement spaces of like protest, and then an even bigger disconnect between what happens in like these spaces and what's happening in the streets. And I feel like it's so poignant in so many places. Like, I don't want to go into details, but I've seen people who call themselves organizers, like fighting to control the sort of, in their eyes, destructive, errant, like destructive impulses of like people who are just like, okay, these cops are like screwing with us every day. I have friends inside. I want to like burn this police station to the ground. And they're like, no, don't do that. We're nonviolent, right? And obviously, like, this is an exaggeration of what some people are on, and then you get to here, and I think that like you think about the difference between the like uprisings in like at Mizu that happened in 2015 and what happened here is like when at Mizu, the first thing they were talking about was their connections to Ferguson because it was so close. And here, like, you tried to mention police brutality and everyone was like, you're gonna destroy our movement, and like muddy the waters. And so I guess like in terms of both of these kinds of disconnects, I do think that there is a really important role of those of us who maybe have put a lot of premium on, who have existed in a lot of these spaces in movements. But I guess I wonder, how do you build those kinds of long-term sort of movements to like destroy these systems that you're talking about? How do you sort of bridge those gaps? Because what you were saying earlier about like, okay, you have 12 million people out in the streets, but you don't see them in front of the White House. I think that the flip side of that, right, is that everybody is like, oh, well, what you're doing is just like spontaneous. You got to get organized. And then people are like, okay, so what do I do to get organized? And they're like, follow us on Instagram. Come out to campaign for this politician. And they're like, well, that's not what we want. We were here to destroy the police. And so I guess like, obviously, I know that a lot, this is not to say this radical work isn't happening, and I'm not asking for, I'm sure there are plenty of people in this room who know about some of this work, and I'm not asking to Henry Box Brown anyone. But I guess like if you have some sort of, in the perhaps slightly more abstract, like how to actually create the culture of sort of destruction of policing and prisons and take those cues from inside where people are saying, abolition, nothing less.
And you have 1 minute.
Sorry.
To answer that big question.
1 minute.
1 minute.
1 minute.
I'm not going to answer the question, but I will say that everything that you just described is old. No, I'm saying it's not new. That's not a critique. What I'm saying is that this has been, you go back to mass mobilizations versus what SNCC is doing in Mississippi. You count the number of people who are organizing the SNCC is very small. You count the people who show up in Washington, D.C. on August 28th, it's large. You think about all the divisions. Sometimes those divisions are around social economic issues. Sometimes divisions around anti-communism. So it's like the difference, of course, is social media and other strategies, but I'm saying this is an age-old issue, and I'm sure that both Garrett and Derecka have some solutions to that age-old issue.
I'll just say briefly, I do think that, to kind of the point that Derecka shared earlier about the disagreement or the sort of lack of clarity around what we mean by abolition, like, we do want a mass movement, but I think we do need to clarify. I mean, that's why I really take the task of defining abolition seriously as a worthy, because I think, like, are we talking about abolishing the state? And a lot of people are not talking about abolishing the state. But then how do we imagine a state existing without police and prisons? Like, I don't think that could exist, but people clearly do.
Oh, Gary's an anarchist. This is new. I didn't know this. This is like spicy. I wasn't ready.
Anyway. No, so I think we need more space to really hash out what we're talking about. Like, are we talking about abolition and capitalism? I didn't know we were talking about that, you know, so, but no, I don't think it's a thing to be resolved as much a contradiction to be lived.
Right.
Derecka, you have the last word.
Last word, oh, Jesus. Okay, so I agree with a big part of your assessment. I wrote about this actually in January, that I'm nervous that with the rise of social media, what has happened with online organizing is that we have organizers perhaps inadvertently have created a like, share, subscribe culture, and that's how people can get involved in the movement, which is very, very different than come to this meeting, sit here for 3 hours to like do an orientation. Can you offer this as a sacrifice of your time and your labor and of your talent? So I think that organizers are trying to figure out how to do mass absorption with the rise of the internet, and I think it's very challenging. I've seen and constantly working through those challenges. I think similar also to what I was saying earlier about people channeling our like hopes and dreams into like specific career ambitions on the left. Right. I'm very nervous about that. I think a similar thing has happened too around how do we effectuate change. And so a long time ago, you would see like these vibrant movements to shut things down and use all tactics from revolutionary violence to the law to figure it out. Now when something happens, everyone gives money to the ACLU. Right. When did the ACLU become like the front line? No shade to the ACLU, like not really like no shade to ACLU, but they become like, I don't know, the Che Guevara of like our move. It's so wild. I'm like, every time there's a crisis, it's like, we're gonna take them to court, and then people give money for them to go to court. And it's like, yeah, we need to go to court, but we also need much more like mass mobilizations and people entering into organizations and finding political homes to figure out how to answer these questions. And so I'm attracted to organizations like Dissenters, who is trying to build a youth movement to end militarism, who's fighting to keep ROTCs off of campuses, who's fighting against the 1033 transfer programs, who's trying to do deep political organizing around these issues. And so we have those examples that exist, and they're engaging in lots of different tactics and trying to figure out how to absorb people to then effectuate that, right? And so I think the more we realize the terrain where people now are just donating to a nonprofit, or people in the past who didn't have political representation that looked like them. So now you think you're fighting a white supremacist structure that's keeping black people or women out, and now we have the most amount of diverse representation. 3 people are still being killed a day by the police. More than 1 million black people are still locked up. Black women still have wealth of $5. So the political representation through diversity is an answer, because who was it? Like Fred Hampton said, we were saying white when we should have been saying capitalist. All right, our critiques were like being lost in the wrong places. And so I think that we absolutely need political homes. We need organizations to really think about the traditions that get people off of line and into seats. And that's very hard, but it's something that we just have to figure out and do.
Please join me. Thank you all for just an incredible and eye-opening discussion.